There's a saying that goes, talent imitates, genius steals. And if you're a fan of pretty much any form of entertainment, then you'll probably already know this to be the case. After all, who are Led Zeppelin if not a band that heavily borrowed much of their music and lyrics from old blues songs of the past, reworking them from there into something new? And if you're more of a movie buff, you'll be all too aware that Quentin Tarantino has made a career out of remixing his favorite cult films, turning them into legitimate box office hits in the process. So it should come as no surprise then that the wrestling world is no stranger to this phenomenon too, with some of the greatest and not so greatest gimmicks of all time being almost wholesale ripped off from someone else. So join us today as we take a look at some of the best examples of this in Gimmick Infringement, wrestling's greatest copycat characters. And if we're going to start somewhere, then we might as well start with one of the most famous superstars of all time, and that's the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Yes, despite being regarded by many to be the greatest in-ring wrestler ever, and the man who made the gimmick famous by taking it all across the world as the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion, Slick Rick was not the first person to use this one as, prior to him coming to the forefront in the mid-1970s, Buddy Rogers was the original Nature Boy. And it wasn't as if Rogers was an obscure figure in the industry either, as throughout his decades-long career that started all the way back in 1939, he'd become one of the most famous wrestlers on the planet after picking up notable wins over the likes of Ed Strangler Lewis and Lou Thesz. This then would see him become a 4-time NWA Texas Heavyweight Champion, as with his bleached blonde hair and cocky attitude, he'd proclaim himself to be the Nature Boy, the unbeatable heel of the territory. Soon after that, and he'd expand out nationwide as he started working for the likes of Sam Mushnick in St. Louis and Vince McMahon Sr. in New York, all while booking his own territory in Chicago. And come 1961, all this hard work would have paid off when he became the NWA World Heavyweight Champion after defeating Pat O'Connor in what was, at the time, dubbed the match of the century. Following this, he became the inaugural WWF champion when that promotion seceded from the NWA in 1963, something which only further cemented his legacy as a legend of the business. So that was why, upon trying to figure out a new gimmick for himself in 1974, Ric Flair would outright steal the Nature Boy's moniker, look, and attitude, something which Rogers was only too happy to give the go-ahead for once he saw how good the youngster was in the ring. After that, Flair would go on such a legendary run that by the 1980s, he would be the true Nature Boy in many people's eyes, an opinion which is hard to argue with when you take into account the fact that come the end of his run, he'd have won at least 16 world titles and had some of the greatest matches of all time. But as it happened, he wouldn't be the only person doing the Nature Boy gimmick in the 80s because, while he was riding high as NWA World Champion, Buddy Landel was also taking up the moniker. And while he wouldn't have the same level of success as Rick did, Landel would also make a nice career for himself as a multi-time regional heavyweight champion, proving that the character is seemingly impossible to not hit a home run with. And the Nature Boy hasn't been the only stolen gimmick that saw someone rise to the top of the industry as, over in the WWF at the same time, Hulk Hogan was taking more than a few cues from superstar Billy Graham. Yes, if you thought the tie-dyed and muscle-bound look of the Hulkster was something he came up with by himself, then you'd be very wrong, as almost a full decade before Hulkamania swept the world, Billy Graham was showing off his massive pythons in the AWA, NWA, and WWF. In fact, it was in the latter promotion that the superstar would be the one to dethrone Bruno Sammartino and end his second reign as WWF Heavyweight Champion, something which would trigger a whole new era in the company. So, clearly taking notes then, a young Hogan would debut in the NWA just a few years later and, there, build a new character for himself, one who looked, spoke, and acted suspiciously like the former WWF champion. Of course, you all know what happens next. After developing this into a babyface gimmick, the Hulkster would take the industry mainstream and spark the golden age of WWE, with him becoming a pop culture icon from there and arguably the most famous wrestler in the world to this day. And how did Graham feel about this? Well, not great as it happened, because upon feeling like he'd been ripped off, the superstar would talk a lot of trash about Hogan publicly in the years following this. That said, it appears like any ill feelings between them have since been mended, as by all accounts, they appear to be on good terms now, something we can't necessarily say is the same for Ryback and Goldberg. Now, to be fair, we don't know for certain that there's bad blood between the two, but given how Ryback likes to piss everyone in the industry off at this point, we wouldn't be surprised to hear that there was heat. But of course, if anything, Ryback should be thankful to Bill, because had it not been for the latter's run in WCW during the late 90s, where he went on a 173-match winning streak and became the face of the company in the process, the big guy might never have had the template to work from. Yes, dominating figures in wrestling are nothing new, but the whole presentation of Goldberg was clearly an inspiration for Ryback, as upon the character's debut in WWE in 2012, he would feature a suspiciously similar bald-headed and muscle-bound look, all while going on a win streak of his own. And this would quickly lead to many fans chanting Goldberg at him whenever he came out. With them loving the remix of the Unstoppable Monster going on a win streak, he'd find himself in a WWE World Title match with then-champion CM Punk by the end of the year. Unfortunately though, not wanting to take the title off of Punk yet, WWE soon realized they'd booked themselves into a corner, and so, inside Hell in a Cell, they were forced to end the challenger's streak early. After that, his momentum would stall as he lost 2 more attempts at winning the big one, all before then falling into more of an upper mid-card role as he became a foil to the likes of The Shield. Yes, while it was a good idea to try it out, in the end, the whole Ryback experiment never succeeded in creating a star on the same level of Goldberg. That said, he can at least take solace in the fact that his one-time tag team partner Curtis Axel would have an even more disappointing run. And this one is even sadder because, as the son of Curt Hennig, Axel should have been a surefire hit when he debuted with the company in the early 2010s. Unfortunately though, with him being far from perfect in the ring, and limited on the mic too, you're looking at you, Genesis of McGillicuddy promo, he ended up quickly slipping into an undercard role after a failed run as a Paul Heyman guy in 2013. So it must have felt like a second shot at life then when, in 2015, the son of Mr. Perfect would begin a new comedy gimmick which saw him team with Damian Sandow to start Axel Mania. And the reason for this was that, by then, Sandow was already working a gimmick as Macho Mandow, a pretty funny imitation of Randy Savage. So, needing a Hogan to complete the new Mega Powers, Axel would start coming to the ring in full Hulkster regalia, with him from there proclaiming that the upcoming WrestleMania 31 would be the birth of Axelmania. Of course, as a complete comedy jobber by this point, things would not go to plan for Axel as, at the Showcase of the Immortals, he'd fail to win the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal. After that though, the 21st Century Mega Powers would formalize their union with a very intense handshake as, from there, they hoped to rebound by winning the tag team gold together. Sadly, however, before that could happen, the Axelmania gimmick would be dropped when a private tape of Hulk Hogan using racist language was leaked to the press, causing the company to cut ties with him for a while as they let the heat die down. And this was a shame because, with the gimmick in place and his partnership with Sandow set, it looked like Curtis Axel was finally starting to get over. But of course, while this imitation game might have been new to him at the time, something which led to him struggling to recover, it was far from the first time his tag partner had undergone such a change, as prior to that, he'd gotten himself hugely over as Damian Mizdao, the personal stunt double to The Miz. Yes, this one started when, after getting the lead role in the WWE Superstars-produced film The Marine 3 in 2013, The Miz would come back to the company under a new gimmick of someone who thought he was now a Hollywood A-lister. And as an A-lister, of course, there was no way he was going to do his own stunts anymore. So instead, he'd bring in Damian Sandow to take the role of his own personal stunt double. But while this gimmick might have looked like death at first, Sandow, or Mizdao as he was then becoming known, quickly became a hit with both fans and his peers watching backstage as, standing at ringside, he'd mimic every bump The Miz took, creating some comedy gold moments in the process. In fact, so over did he get that after a while, it was him, and not The Miz, who people really wanted to see, with them going as far as to chant "We want Mizdao" whenever the two came to the ring. And this then led to the delusional A-lister getting jealous of his stunt double, causing friction between the two that would eventually lead to them blowing up during the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal at WrestleMania 31. After that, it looked like Sandow was ready for a big babyface push, but unfortunately, for one reason or another, this never came to pass, and instead, he'd spend a couple more years milling around on the mid-card, all before reinventing himself again as Aaron Rex in both Impact and the NWA. And he wasn't the only person who's been able to reinvent himself in Impact over the years either. Hell, he wasn't even the only one to do a great Macho Man impression, as back in 2006, Jay Lethal would stumble upon a hit with Black Machismo. Of course, by this point, Lethal had spent years working for the likes of Ring of Honor and building a name for himself as one of the best in-ring wrestlers on the planet. That said, it wasn't until he joined TNA that his character skills would really get a chance to shine upon revealing to the world that he had quite possibly the greatest Randy Savage impression known to man. And this would first come to light when, in December of 2006, both he and Sanjay Dutt would start appearing in backstage segments with Kevin Nash, segments where Big Daddy Cool would try to give him a makeover by drawing more character out of him. And all that would eventually lead to a segment called Paparazzi Idol, a play on American Idol, which saw Lethal impress the series of judges by doing a pitch-perfect recreation of the Macho Man. So with this new skill uncovered, the former Ring of Honor star would lean into it more heavily in the weeks that followed, when he began coming out to the ring to pomp and circumstance, all while dressed in full Savage attire. On top of that, now rechristening himself as Black Machismo, he'd borrow some of the former WWF champion's moves, such as the diving elbow drop finisher, all while claiming the Macho Man's famous "Ooh yeah" catchphrase while he was at it. And this would prove to be such a hit with fans that soon after, Lethal would be competing for both the X Division title and the tag team titles. As well as that, he would go on to claim to have gotten the direct blessing of Savage himself after having had a phone call with him, something which only motivated him to go even further as, by June 2007 Slammiversary, he'd win the X Division title for the first time after defeating Chris Sabin. Yes, with just a little sprinkling of macho madness, Jay Lethal had become a made man, and over the next couple of years, he'd end up having a second run with the X Division title, all while also getting the chance to ape the famous Savage and Elizabeth engagement segment when, in his best gravelly voice, he'd get in the ring with his, at the time, on-screen girlfriend SoCal Val and ask her, "Will you marry me?" But for as successful as Black Machismo turned out to be, the same couldn't be said for another figure who tried to mimic a popular WWF star of the Hogan era. As while the Ultimate Warrior may have been a top guy, the Renegade was far closer to the bottom of the barrel. Of course, the history of this one is somewhat shrouded in mystery, as while many still claim the Renegade had been brought into WCW during 1995 specifically to build up to the Warrior's eventual debut, Eric Bischoff has always argued this wasn't the case. No, instead, he just apparently thought it would be funny to have Hulk Hogan, while engaged in a feud with Ric Flair and Vader, spend weeks hyping up an ultimate surprise, a surprise which, when seen in silhouette, looked suspiciously like a certain former challenger of his. So with fans clearly expecting Jim Hellwig to show up then, they were all left disappointed when, instead, the Renegade made his debut at that March's uncensored pay-per-view, coming out to a cheap knockoff of the Warrior's WWF theme and poorly mimicking many of his moves. But even if fans were disappointed, Eric Bischoff, clearly still in love with the idea, decided to keep going with it anyway, as in the weeks and months that followed, the Renegade would pick up Jimmy Hart as a manager and then go on to defeat Arn Anderson for the WCW World Television Championship. After that, though, with things clearly not getting over, the boss admitted defeat and sent his new signing down to the mid-card as, from there, he would become something of a joke, making fewer and fewer television appearances as time went on. And even when he did turn up, he'd usually be on the losing end, something which continued all the way up until 1998, at which point the real Ultimate Warrior would debut with the company, pretty much destroying any remaining relevance the Renegade had in one fell swoop. But he wasn't the only cheap WWF knockoff WCW would put out there around this time, as just a year later, the then failing promotion would try their best to capitalize on the success of China over in Vince McMahon's company when they introduced their own muscle-bound female, Asia. Yes, the name leaves little doubt as to what was going on here, but, well, things like this have worked out in the past. When it came to Christy Wolf, the woman who portrayed Asia, well, she just wasn't the performer that Joni Laurer was. Still, that didn't stop WCW's then head writer Vince Russo from trying his best to get her over, as throughout the winter of 1999, he'd book his newest creation to join the Revolution, a stable made up of Shane Douglas, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn. Of course, come the start of 2000, 3 of those men would have joined Eddie Guerrero in jumping ship to the WWF, leading Asia to turn babyface as, from there, she would venture out onto her own. And at one point, she'd even challenged Medusa for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship, all before then getting into a brief feud with Oklahoma, co-head writer Ed Ferrara's poor taste imitation of Jim Ross. Following that, Asia would begin to appear more sporadically, with her eventually disappearing from TV altogether by the summer of 2000. And of course, when WWE bought out WCW less than a year after this, Asia would find out that her contract was not going to be picked up, with this leading to her retiring from the industry altogether and returning to the world of bodybuilding. But while she may not have made the jump to Vince McMahon's promotion in 2001, another notable WCW mid-carder would. Unfortunately for him, though, Chuck Palumbo's attempts to mimic The Undertaker's biker character at that time would not end well for him. Yes, after returning to WWE in 2006 following a prior run which saw him act as, at various points, a member of the Full-Blooded Italians and the on-screen lover of Billy Gunn, Palumbo would debut a newer incarnation of himself, one which took heavy inspiration from the Dead Man's run in the early 2000s. But to be fair, it wasn't as if the former WCW star didn't have experience with motorcycles in real life, as he was actually something of a bike aficionado, so much so that he would even run a personal business building his own hogs. And this then would end up coming to the attention of Vince McMahon, who, upon hearing about it, decided to create a new biker gimmick for Palumbo that would better fit his real-life character. So after a series of vignettes aired over the weeks that followed, which saw him working on a number of different bikes, the former four-time WCW Tag Team Champion would make his re-debut in May of that year. That said, while he would pick up a number of lower card wins on the likes of Heat at this point, fans were quick to notice the similarities the gimmick shared with the Deadmans during the early 2000s, and so didn't really react to it in the way management hoped they might. And this was why, despite eventually moving up to the SmackDown brand and entering into a brief on-screen relationship with The Undertaker's future wife, Michelle McCool, things would never really progress much further, and by November of 2008, Palumbo would be released from his contract. Of course, at least he had a chance of succeeding when he debuted. It's just a shame the same can't be said for Glenn Jacobs and Rick Bogner, as, in 1996, after Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had left WWF to go join WCW, they'd be hired to play the new Diesel and Razor Ramon. Yes, with Vince McMahon upset that he lost two of his biggest stars and feeling like, as he owned the IP, he could simply recast the roles, he would bring in the two pretenders in September of that year and try to pass them off as the originals. Of course, it should go without saying that fans quickly saw through this ruse, however, with them immediately letting the company know how they felt about it by either raining down boos on the duo or just not reacting at all. And if we're being honest, Vince McMahon probably knew this was going to happen all along, as instead of having himself be shown as being publicly responsible for the decision, he'd instead cast Jim Ross as the man who had kayfabe brought the two into the company. But that didn't make things any more entertaining to watch, as, failing to get over with the fans, the fake Diesel and Razor would soon fall down into undercard positions, usually losing to the real stars like Bret Hart, The Undertaker, and Rocky Maivia, all while getting nothing to show for it themselves. So realizing things were doomed then, McMahon would quietly drop the whole thing following the 1997 Royal Rumble, with Bogner leaving the company at this point to go work elsewhere, while Glenn Jacobs would be repacked into a far more famous and successful gimmick, Kane. And while Kane was riding high during the Attitude Era in the years that followed this, one more copycat gimmick would present itself as, in an attempt to mock Goldberg's 173-0 win streak over in WCW, WWF would introduce a figure who couldn't get a victory to save his own life, Gillberg. And Gillberg, as it happened, would be portrayed by journeyman wrestler Dwayne Gill, with him making his first appearance at the 1998 Survivor Series, where he would lose to Mankind in Round 1 of the Deadly Games tournament. Gillberg would continue his losing streak after joining up with the Job Squad, a stable made up of fellow mid-carders such as Al Snow, Bob Holly, and Too Cold Scorpio. And to further add to the Goldberg parody then, Dwayne Gill would come out to the ring with sparklers and fire extinguishers instead of fireworks, something which usually served to scare him out of his boots, all while he would get to utter his catchphrase following each loss, "Who's first?" And at one point, this would even get to see him challenge Triple H for the WWF World Heavyweight title on the August 31st, 1999 episode of SmackDown, a match which predictably ended with the Game getting an easy win and taking a further dig at WCW while he was at it. Of course, this wouldn't be Gillberg's most notable moment as it turned out though, because after disappearing from the company in 2000, he'd returned for a cameo in 2003, when as part of The Rock's feud with Goldberg, Dwayne Gill would be brought out to mock the former WCW champion, with this only serving to anger Bill and cause him to deliver a beatdown to his pretender. But while Goldberg may not have been a fan of being mimicked, others such as Buddy Rogers, Billy Graham, and Randy Savage seem to have taken things far better, with each of them understanding that, at the end of the day, having someone else build on what you've created isn't the worst thing in the world, as imitation really is the most sincere form of flattery. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.